In this chapter, we will discuss research methods using sociology. First, the paradox. If we successfully answer one question, it only spawns others. There is no moment when a social scientist's work is done. Good sociological research begins with a puzzle. What causes what to happen? A good research question must be both precise and answerable. Once we have the answer to a specific question, it only raises more questions. The process is never finished. Please watch the video attached to the code in your book. Your own experience could lead to research. Experience can prevent people from seeing things as well. Experience filters perceptions of reality, which is the biggest problem for sociological research. Filtering occurs in 4 stages. Values or real-life experiences and passions of sociologists motivate research. Sociologists favor certain theories for explaining social problems, and previous research influences sociologists' interpretations. Methods sociologists use to gather data mold our perceptions. Objectivity and subjectivity each play an important role in science, including sociology. Objectivity is a reality check. Subjectivity leads us to define which aspects of reality are worth checking. You can never be purely objective, yet we can use techniques to minimize bias, which results in more accurate perceptions of reality. Subjective values and passions are sources of creativity. And this is an example for visual learners, how the research process goes and how we should also filter our perception how we conduct research. In science, seeing is believing. In everyday life, believing is seeing, as our biases influence our observations. Scientists, including sociologists, develop ways of collecting, observing, and thinking about evidence that minimize our chance of drawing biased conclusions. So now we will discuss the research cycle. First, we must formulate a research question. What are we interested in? What do we want to find an answer for? Next, we review existing literature. Researchers must elaborate their research questions in a clear light of what other sociologists have already debated and discovered. Reading relevant sociological literature stimulates researchers' sociological imaginations and allows them to refine their initial questions and prevents duplication of effort. Next, we will select a research method. Each method is best suited for studying a different kind of problem. When choosing a method, one must keep these strengths and weaknesses in mind. Next, we will collect data based upon the research method that we have selected. And once we have the data, we will now analyze the data. Data confirms some of our expectations and confound others, which requires us to think creatively about familiar issues, reconsider the relevant theoretical and research literature, and abandon pet ideas. And there's 2 major camps for research analysis. One is qualitative and the other is quantitative. Qualitative analysis is aimed at understanding patterns of social relationships in small-scale social settings and the meaning people attach to those relationships. Quantitative analysis associates specific social qualities, types, and degrees of knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, and so on with discrete quantities or numbers. And lastly, we will report and publicize the results. And this provides use to the sociological communities, the subjects of the research, or the wider society. In addition, publicizing research allows other sociologists to scrutinize and criticize the research. And here is the research cycle. So again, we start with formulating the question, move to review existing literature, select a method, collect data, analyze data, report results, and then start with a new question. In some cases, this is not how the flow always works. You might have to find sometimes you go back to another step. You might find something in your data that makes you want to re-examine the literature or really make sure that you are applying your research method correctly. So again, this is in the perfect scenario, this is what the research cycle would look like. There are 2 major approaches to research. First is the deductive approach to research. This is when you start with a theory, and then you move to creating a hypothesis or hypotheses, We make empirical observations and then analyze the data collected through observation to confirm, reject, or modify the original theory. So a good way to know the difference between this type of research, deductive, is with this. You start with a theory and move down. Deductive, down, D. The next type is inductive. And this is when you start with an empirical observations. You start with the data and you work with that data to form a theory. And lastly, this will determine if a correlation exists by noticing if a change is observed and two things simultaneously. We're starting with the data and we're moving into a theory. So into inductive. And here is the cycle again on how we would conduct research. If we are again using a deductive approach, we'll start with theory, create some hypotheses, we'll collect data, and this is our empirical observations, analyze that, and then confirm with our theory. If we're starting with inductive approach though, we have our empirical observations or our data, we analyze that data, we build a theory, and test that theory again and move forward. So again, deductive, move down using a theory, and then inductive, we move into the data to make a theory. Next, let's talk about specific types of research methods. Research methods are standard rules that social scientists follow when trying to establish a causal relationship between two elements. And when we do use various techniques or measurements, we have three basic things we look for regarding quantitative research: reliability, validity, and generalizability. Although these three things are also asked of in qualitative research, but it looks different. So reliability is the degree to which a measurement procedure yields consistent results. So you're hitting that target over and over again. The question you would ask is, would another researcher interpret or measure things in the same way? Validity is the degree to which a measure actually measures what is intended to measure. And you would ask, are the researcher's interpretations accurate? Next, generalizability. This exists when research findings apply beyond the specific case examined. So how far can we really speak about a phenomenon using this particular data? Is it just about this set of students at this college, or is it all college students or all adults? How far can we extend the findings? There's a whole host of research methods that we can use to collect data. And a few are participant observation, interviews, survey research, comparative research, experimentation, content analysis, and historical methods. Different kinds of data collection help researchers get at different aspects of a research project. Many researchers use mixed methods approach, meaning that they employ two or more kinds of data collection to get more thorough information. It is important to decide which kind of data collection will help you get the best results for your study, and not to design your study around the kind of research you want to do. So start with your question, what's the best technique to use to answer that question? So quantitative research. Quantitative methods seek to obtain information about the social world that is in or can be converted to numeric form. And now we could talk about different types of variables while using quantitative research. First is a dependent variable. It is the outcome that a research is trying to explain. So explaining graduation rates. And the next is an independent variable. It is a measured factor that the researcher believes has a causal impact on the dependent variable. So it's causing various types or levels of graduation rates for various groups. And my independent variable in my research, I look at if students are working, which means that their time is not committed just to studying, which may lead to lower rates of graduation. So we also need to discuss our hypotheses. This goes again after you develop a research question. A hypothesis is a proposed relationship between two variables and represented by either the null hypothesis or an alternative hypothesis. A null hypothesis states there is no relationship between the variables. So for instance, there is no relationship between if you work and whether you are successful and you do graduate. The alternative hypothesis we can say is that those who work more than 10 hours a week are less likely to graduate within 4 years. And we must be very careful when we interpret our findings and remember that causality and correlation are two different things. Causality is the idea that change in one factor results in a corresponding change in another factor. With correlation, you notice that there's a pattern. As this increases, this other factor may increase. Or in the case of graduation, as hours of work increase, the lower success rate a student has in terms of graduating. So there's a pattern. Doesn't mean that working causes people not to graduate. That is not what the data will suggest. So overall, sociologists conduct research to try to prove causation. Does one factor cause a change in the other? To prove causation, correlation and time order are established and alternative explanations are ruled out. So again, one factor, the factor has to come before the change or the outcome, and all other reasonings have to be explained away. Causation is stronger assertion than correlation. Again, so let's just reemphasize again that causality means a change in the independent variable x produces a change in the dependent variable y. We establish causality by demonstrating an association exists between x and y, so there's some kind of pattern there, and x precedes y in terms of time order. The introduction of a causally prior control variable does not result in the original association disappearing. So even when we control for various factors, that pattern is still there. Causality is the analysis of causes and effects. Information on how widely or narrowly a research finding applies can help us establish the causes of a social phenomenon. Participant observers tend not to think in mechanical cause and effect terms, as they prefer to view their subjects as engaged in fluid processes of social interaction. So let's look at this pattern. Poor health causes lower income. Do you think that is true? Is that always the case? Let's take this as a given. How would you explain that poor health leads to lower income? And next, lower income causes poor health. Explain this relationship. How does lower income cause poor health? And this, we have here a mediating factor that causes a change in the relationship between health and income. So we have reckless tendency may lead to poor health, and reckless tendencies may lead to lower income. So would we say that lower income definitely causes poor health? Well, maybe someone of a lower income performs some kind of reckless tendency that leads to poor health. Or does poor health may make us more likely to perform recklessly, and which leads to lower health. So again, we have this mediating factor that changes the relationship. So we do not have a causal relationship between health and income. And now we have a spurious relationship. A spurious factor is a factor that makes the relationship false. So let's say that we started with the relationship that nutrition leads to certain height. So for instance, better nutrition leads to increased height, but it becomes a spurious relationship because maybe the causal relationship goes away when we introduce infection. And then that person may not be able to absorb nutrition correctly. And again, that relationship from nutrition to height is altered. So how can we control so we can have a more definite answer what's causal? We can use experiments. We use randomization to create two similar groups, Group A and Group B. One is control group and the other one's experimental group. The hypothesis cause is introduced to only one of those groups, the experimental group. The groups are compared before and after one of the groups has been exposed to the hypothesized cause. So let's say, for instance, we're giving you all great nutritious food, and our particular question is, does great food lead to increased performance in classes? And so we can give you a test for a baseline before either group is introduced to the food, and then test afterwards, after let's say a semester, see which group performed best to see if that food really does have an effect. What are the steps in experiment? First, we test the baseline for both groups before we introduce the independent variable or the treatment. And after a period of time, we have a remeasurement of the dependent variable and experimental and control group. So again, performance level. And then we have assessment of the experimental effect. Did we see a difference between the two groups? Measurement of the dependent variable. Again, the presumed effect in a cause and effect relationship and experimental control groups is what we're trying to see the difference in. We're looking at the outcome variable. The introduction of the independent variable, again, the food, good food, is presumed to be the cause of the change in the dependent variable. So we determine the change in the dependent variable by remeasurement of the dependent variable for both experimental and control groups. And if we see a difference, then we can say that the treatment or independent variable does have an effect on the dependent variable. The strengths of experiments are that they're precise and repeatable. They have high reliability and the ability to establish causality. However, they have several weaknesses. Usually they're performed in very artificial situations. There's a validity problem where they're not really measuring what they're supposed to measure. And then the Hawthorne effect. Do people really perform the same way in these experiments because they know they are being watched? For experiments, please know how to identify an experimental group. Again, this is the treatment group, the control group in which the experimental group is being compared to, the dependent variable, the outcome variable, and the independent variable or the treatment given to the experimental group. Another type of experiment is field experiments, and this retains the benefits of experimental design while overcoming validity problems. So how we can conduct a field experiment by first introducing the independent variable themselves, or observe what happens when the independent variables is introduced in the normal course of life. Field experiments and natural experiments are experiments in natural settings that attempt to overcome the validity problems and still retain the benefits of experimental design. So think about how you would introduce the natural cause of events. We can look at historical events, and we can also just test when natural things happen. How was a person reacting prior to the introduction of the treatment or the natural cause compared to prior to that time? Again, here are the weaknesses and strengths of using experiments. Strengths are high reliability, and it's excellent for establishing cause and effect relationships. Weaknesses are low validity for many sociological problems and problems with generalizability. Our next type of method that we can use is survey. Surveys ask people questions about their knowledge, attitudes, or behavior, either in face-to-face or telephone interviews or in paper and pencil format. Survey studies examine part of a group called a sample. It's part of the population of research interest that is selected for analysis. In order to learn about the whole group, we use a sample. The whole group is called a population. It's the entire group in which the researcher wishes to generalize. And there are various types of samples that we can use for a survey. First is a representative sample. It is a group of people chosen so their characteristics closely match those of the population in interest. Convenient samples choose people who are easiest to reach, thus is also highly unlikely to be representative. A probability sample are chosen at random. The individual's chance of being chosen must be known and be greater than 0. This enhances generalizability and representativeness within known margins of error. A sampling frame is a list of all the people in the population of interest and is needed to draw a probability sample. Once a sampling frame is chosen or created, individuals must be selected by random chance. There are 3 main ways of conducting a survey. First is self-administered questionnaire. This is like a mail-in survey or maybe one online, and is relatively inexpensive but sometimes results in unexpectedly low response rates. This is referring to the number of people who answer the questionnaire divided by the number of people asked to do so. Face-to-face interviews involve the presentation of questions and allowable responses for the respondent by the interview during a meeting. They are very expensive because you need to have staff trained properly, and also you have to pay the interviewers usually. Telephone interviews elicit relatively high response rates and are relatively cheap to administer. So let's talk about questions of validity using surveys. A closed-ended question provides respondents with a list of permitted answers. Open-ended questions allow respondents to answer questions in their own words. These types of questions are particularly good for exploratory research. Although a survey is not ideal for conducting exploratory research, survey data are useful for discovering relationships among variables, including cause and effect relationships. Like experiments, the effects of independent variables can be measured. However, the effects of irrelevant variables are removed not by randomization, but by manipulating the survey data. One of the problems with using surveys is validity. There are various threats to validity using surveys. First one is undercounting. Undercounting occurs when there is an imperfect sampling across a population frame. Non-response occurs when some people refuse to participate in the survey. If non-respondents differ from respondents in ways that are relevant to the research topic, then the conclusions one draws from the survey may be in jeopardy. Response rates should be at 70% or higher. Next, we have response bias. This is unwillingness of some respondents to answer some questions frankly. This problem can be overcome by carefully selecting and training interviewers and closely supervising their work. So this again refers to respondents not being truthful when they answer. Next, wording effects. This is asking, leading, or confusing questions, or questions that refer to multiple, unimportant, or non-concurrent events. And the way questions are phrased or ordered can influence or invalidate responses. Here are the strengths and weaknesses of using surveys. Strengths: good reliability, and they're useful for establishing cause and effect relationships, and they're good for generalizability. Some problems with surveys include validity, but techniques can be used to boost validity. So sampling is very, very important. It is a political issue. So how we sample the population we are studying can have significant effect on what we end up finding. The Census Bureau's sampling methods are used as an example in the text. When federal funding and congressional seats are dependent on population size, it matters significantly how accurately the Census Bureau counts in the U.S. population. This year is a U.S. Census polling year. So if you get that form in your mail, please fill it out. So we don't always have to deal with humans when we are doing research. We can use artifacts or other types of materials to study what humans do. And by using pre-existing documents, we can save ourselves or other researchers time and money because they are available in libraries or on the web. Secondly, they cover entire populations and are collected using rigorous methods, and it does not require live subjects. In addition, the researcher's presence does not influence the subject's behavior. Some types of existing documents that have been analyzed include diaries, newspapers, published historical works. The most frequently used source of pre-existing documents include census data, police crime reports, records of key life events. One big disadvantage of using pre-existing documents is that it often contains biases that reflect the interests of the individuals and organizations that created the data. And these data sources are not created with the researcher's needs in mind. So you will have to go back and look at the social, cultural, and political climate context in which those particular documents were created. You cannot use your culture's understandings of those things and how we look at various phenomenon and apply it directly onto that artifact. You have to look at that context for that time. The strengths and weaknesses of using pre-existing documents includes, for strengths, often unexpected, often inexpensive, and easy to obtain. It provides good coverage, it's useful for historical analysis, and is non-reactive. The weaknesses included often contains biases reflecting the interests of their creators and not the interest of the researchers.